Okay, I think we're just about 7 o'clock. So I think I'll start. All right. We're at 7 o'clock, right? Okay, so hello and good evening, everyone. And for those in the United States or in any other part of the world, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. I'm Manoj Keval Ramani. I'm a research fellow studying China at the Takshashila Institution. And I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Takshashila and the Hudson Institute to this conversation. Before we begin, just a little bit about the two institutions for those who are new here. I'm sure if you've joined us through the three webinars that we've already had, you've probably heard this before. So the Takshashila Institution is an independent center for research and education and public policy. We're a non-partisan think tank, and we're concerned with how India shapes the world and also how the world shapes India in turn. We are also focused on transforming how India is governed and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics, which is all critical to the conversation that we're having today. Our collaborators in this journey is the Hudson Institute. Hudson was founded in 1961 by strategist Irwin Khan. Hudson is focused on helping to manage strategic transitions to the future through interdisciplinary studies in defense, international relations, economics, healthcare, technology, culture, and law. What are we collaborating on? Well, this is the fourth of our 6-part discussion series that we've called the China Challenge. Our aim in these conversations is to answer one specific question, which is how can and how should India and the United States respond to China's increasing assertiveness and growing global ambitions? The format that we're using for these conversations to address this question is what we call a deep webinar. It's something that we've sort of come up with. These are essentially thoughtfully curated conversations that bring together great panelists and discussants from diverse backgrounds. And we'd also like to see audience engagement. So throughout this conversation, please try and pose your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please also feel free to post your questions over there, and somebody from the team will then try and pick them up, and we'll try and address as many of those as possible. Okay, so on to today's conversation. So we've got two rather interesting and unique panelists today who can offer us a very interesting perspective on China's technological rise and its implications for the world, particularly the US and India, but also far more broadly. Our first panelist is Karthik Nachiyappan. He's a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, with a joint appointment at the South Asian Studies program. Karthik's research focuses on India's technology policy, specifically the regulation of issues like data, cybersecurity, social media, and artificial intelligence, and also how policies influence India's positions on global rules covering these technology issues, which is essentially something that's going to be critical going forward as this US-China tech Cold War sort of continues to develop, and given the emerging technologies and the new regulations that are supposed to come out around those in different countries. Our second panelist is Mr. Eric Brown. Eric's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he studies Asian and Middle Eastern affairs, international security and development, alternative geopolitical futures, and US diplomacy and strategy. In recent years, Eric's work has focused on the contest over order in West Asia, the geostrategic ramifications of growing trans-Asian connectivity, coping with state fragility, and US security strategy. That's an extremely broad set of things that Eric is looking at, and I think all of that will sort of come into play as we talk about China's technological rise also. So a warm welcome to both our panelists. But before we sort of move ahead to starting this conversation, I also want to introduce three discussants. First is Saurabh Chandra, who is the co-founder of Ati Motors, which is a unique Indian startup developing autonomous industrial vehicles. We also have Shruti Badri. She's the co-founder of Akimba, a platform that helps people build social habits that will deepen their relationships at home and within the community and with people that they care about. Shruti is also currently part of Takshashila's postgraduate program in public policy, and is interested in conversations around technology and China specifically. And finally, Gaurav Jaguli, who's also an alumnus of Takshashila's graduate certificate in public policy program. Gaurav was part of the first cohort of our defense and foreign affairs course, and he writes also about strategic affairs. So welcome to all of you. And I'm hoping that this will be a stimulating conversation, and I'd like to get all of you involved in this conversation. So with these introductions done, let me just turn to the theme of our discussion today. I've briefly sort of mentioned the role of China's technological rise, but let me sort of go back to a couple of days ago, about 10 days ago, the Chinese president met with the country's scientific community to talk about the upcoming 14th five-year plan, which is supposed to be unveiled later this year. He emphasized that science and technological advancement are critical to China's future growth, but he also said these curious sentences, which I'm sure would have raised some eyebrows in DC and other parts of the world. Xi Jinping said, science knows no borders, which is all well and good, but he also said, scientists have a motherland. And that's something that you need to keep in mind. And a few weeks before that, he'd met entrepreneurs in the country and he'd asked them to be patriotic first. So that's an interesting juxtaposition to what's happening currently in the US. And all of this is happening as we're seeing this controversy over TikTok's possible sale. I mean, Karthik just informed us before this conversation that TikTok and WeChat have been just banned in the US. And of course, this entire saga over Huawei and 5G and whether we should ban them or not, and the restrictions that the US has placed over them in the last few years, all of which sort of links to this increasing view in the US that sees technology and technological development from a narrow national security prism. And many people believe that at the end of the day, this contest is playing out between China and the US is about attaining technological supremacy. And I want to sort of start with that as our theme. So Eric, firstly, I want to sort of turn to you. From an American perspective, what's driving this tough approach towards China's technological development over the past few years? Why is there this shift to view technology from a national security prism? Is it sort of cynical geopolitical competition between an established power and a rising power? Or is it to get China to play by the rules? Or is it something altogether different that we aren't sort of getting our heads
around? Thank you very much, Manoj, and I'm very happy to be here this morning. I'll keep my remarks short so that we can have a discussion. But in answer to your question, the easy answer is all of the above. But I do want to underscore that I don't believe that this was mainly driven by policy choices of the current US administration. In fact, it was the escalation of this struggle over the future of technology and leadership of technology had begun a long time ago. The main driver of what are now called the geotech wars was in fact a decision made by China's ruling Communist Party some years back that it was not able to play by the established laws of international order. I believe that change began somewhere around the 2008-2009 international financial crisis. You'll recall that China at the time was also facing a rolling crisis within China itself from various labor, religious, and pro-democracy movements. There were also massive ethno-religious riots in Tibet and in Xinjiang. And there were many in PRC who said, when faced with that broad-based crisis, that the best way to handle it would be to liberalize. But from the party's perspective, that was not possible, at least from the perspective of its core Marxist-Leninist operational code, because to liberalize would mean ceding power and control to forces that the party itself could not control. And Xi Jinping, when he came to power in 2012 and 2013, made clear that that when a party such as the Chinese Communist Party cedes power and control, it risks wreaking dysfunction in the state machinery. And it could potentially, he suggested in a speech, it could potentially lead the PRC along a pathway that European or Russian Leninism had been set on in the course of the 1980s when the CPSU rejected its own revolutionary history. So the party at the time, instead of liberalizing, did exactly the opposite. It began to assert all kinds of control, state party control, over the ideational, economic, and political institutions of the PRC. At the same time, it also set about to launch a many-faceted bid to create a more, what I would call a more supportive world order that would allow it to cement its preferred governing arrangements at home. And that many-faceted campaign, which has come to be crystallized in the Belt and Road Initiative and a whole range of other strategic gambits, has many components. It's economic, it's political, it's diplomatic. Many of these areas have become major areas of battle, of skirmishes between the United States and the People's Republic of China. But it's also fundamentally technological. I think it's fair to say that China's Communist Party, you got to hand it to them, they study world affairs very closely and trends very closely. They were certainly not on a holiday from history after 1991, like a good part of the American Republic was. But they understood and grasped the significance of emerging information technology, including 5G and AI, long before, I think, policymakers in democracies did. They understood that in the 21st century, control of the digital networks through which the world's data would flow would become a major source of geopolitical power. And they also understood that these technologies, I think, could be harnessed to make up for its own governance failings and shortcomings at home, and could be harnessed to improve its strategic and geopolitical conditioning all around the world. Now, this has prompted, I think, an overdue challenge from the US administration, from the US, which began, I would say, about three years ago, in a serious way, at least. The American quarrel with a lot of what PRC is attempting to do with technology is clear. A lot of it is about, yes, national economic competitiveness. It's also about US national security and military competitiveness. And that's important because certainly, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, Manoj, the civil military fusion in the PRC is quite deep. There is no distinction between the private sector and the party. The party controls, and it's in fact law in the PRC that even so-called private companies need to serve the party and its interests. But there's a deeper issue to this quarrel. It's not only about a contest for supremacy and for leadership over technology, but as the US sees it, it's fundamentally about the future of humane governance and international norms, including the norms which govern economic life and political life. Recall that the PRC has already exploited and harnessed advanced data technology to subjugate its own people. In Xinjiang, as well as in Hong Kong today, and I would say as well in other provinces of the PRC, such as the Guangdong, Guangzhou, Pearl River Delta area, we have seen the buildup of the world's most advanced police state. This has been enabled by advances in AI technology and facial recognition technology, as you all are aware. The PRC has built a panoptical surveillance system, which it uses to keep people under control. And it's also learning how to use this technology to encourage certain kinds of behaviors, moral outcomes among the people it controls. Meantime, the PRC, through its Digital Silk Road Initiative, has been exporting these technologies around the world. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace had estimated in a report recently that PRC had exported these surveillance technologies to about 63 different countries. I imagine that number has actually grown. I know that in most of the places where I work across Eurasia, including some parts in Africa and some countries that I visited in Latin America, you can see evidence of Huawei and Hikvision and PRC technology being deployed in large urban centers. The American concern about this, of course, one is that it provides the PRC the ability to surveil populations and to use populations data that in other countries. So this is a threat from the US perspective to the sovereignty of nation states around the world. There are deeper concerns as well from a security perspective that the PRC can use its control of other countries' data to politically manipulate them. The opportunities for political manipulation will theoretically grow, in particular when the 50-cent army yields to greater AI armies in the future. And then there's also a concern about what happens when countries get dependent on PRC suppliers. It locks them into a particular trajectory of digital development, a degree of vendor dependency on Huawei and other heavily state subsidized PRC technology companies that makes it very difficult for countries to back out of. Also because 5G is what it is. It's a foundational core technology that will enable other industries of the future. There's a concern that if PRC can control that in other countries, then PRC will also have control over the civilian infrastructure in other countries, and therefore would be able to have leverage over those countries, both economically and politically. More deeply, the concern about the spread of these surveillance technologies is this. When I look at how the PRC discusses this, they are looking for ways to reduce the costs of their authoritarian government at home. And at the same time, I believe by exporting these technologies, they're also looking to create and to foster other authoritarian governments that are dependent on the PRC for their stability. As such, from the US perspective, this is part and parcel of, at least from my perspective, this is part and parcel of the geopolitical supernova that the PRC has become, to build a more supportive world order, to create dependencies on it, and therefore to undermine the international order of sovereign states. And because of that, we can talk more about this, but there have been a number of policy measures that the US has undertaken, both by itself and in conjunction with its allies and partners around the world, to prevent the PRC's ability to establish tech dependencies, and to ultimately also make sure that the PRC does not succeed. But needless to say, the PRC is determined, at least Xi Jinping. I think that there's a lot of doubt in the party today about the wisdom of Xi Jinping's gambits. But certainly Xi Jinping believes that this is necessary for the party's self-preservation and survival in the 21st century. And so they're determined to make these things work and stick. And that, I think, is, as I said, the fundamental driver of these large geotech wars that we've only just begun. So I'll stop there. Thank you. I look forward to hearing and talking with all of you about this.
Thanks so much, Eric. That's an absolutely majestic sweep of what's been happening from an American point of view. And I think you've covered so many different points, which I think we'll come back to also through the course of this conversation. Karthik, I wanted to turn to you, drawing from where Eric sort of talked about a bunch of different things, right? So from the PRC's domestic policies to the US concerns with regard to economic competitiveness, security, military competitiveness, global governance, international norms, Silk Road. Before I sort of get to that, I want to get your thoughts on what do you, sitting in Singapore, also looking at India's approaches to this, how do you perceive the drivers of this competition between the US and China? And what are sort of the perspectives of businesses, investors in East Asia, and even policymakers in India about how do they perceive what's happening between the US and China? Do they see it as this sort of battle for, in some ways, governance and international norms and keeping them far more humane, or is this far more cynical perspective about this being power politics? Karthik?
Great. Thank you, Manoj, for inviting me to this very important discussion. Eric's done such a good job just laying everything out. Has made my task a lot easier for the next few minutes. So let me just begin by saying that the ongoing tech competition between the US and China is a function, as Eric mentioned, of a broader strategic rivalry between both nations. After years when these issues were managed carefully by officials in both Beijing and Washington, although certain irritants were quite evident. There were long-standing concerns about China's industrial policies, market access restrictions, the illicit acquisition of technology through joint ventures or cyber theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. But I think all of these have been exacerbated by China's continued rise. That technology has become so important and central to bilateral tensions demonstrates how critical technology is and will be to the United States remaining the preeminent power in the international order, and China the chief challenger to American primacy. Now, I want to talk about one aspect to this technology competition, which I think does not get enough attention and could be as, if not more important. Now, if you look historically, a lot of the big technological advances like the steam engine, the printing press, electricity, and even semiconductors have generated widespread economic and social benefits to the public everywhere. But it's possible now that the mastery and profitability of next generation technologies, for example, artificial intelligence, big data, 5G communications, nanotechnology, robotics, and quantum computing could be narrower and more highly protected. So in the past, innovators would design products and reap the rewards before other countries would enter the same level playing field and try to compete. But in a future that's dominated by digital technologies, it is possible that certain firms and countries that have established data economies and data monopolies combined with artificial intelligence could easily come to dominate markets abroad, making international competition far more difficult. So the United States, is still ahead of China in totality, but the breadth of Chinese advancements in technology is astonishing, right? So until recently, the US was fairly dismissive, when it came to Chinese innovation. They saw China as a copycat nation that could only steal or rip off innovation. And I think part of American worries is driven now by China's really astonishing technological ascendance and how those market advantages could either limit or prescribe the growth potentials of American firms and that of its allies and partners, including many in Europe, Japan, and India. China's tech sector has surged so much in the past 5 years, with Tencent and Alibaba and other unicorns making their way into the top ranks of global companies when measured from a market capitalization point of view. Now, these companies have grown because of China's massive internet and mobile user base, right? That has also grown exponentially. And American telecom companies in the recent past have lost ground with their Chinese counterparts, especially when it comes to 5G. China also has more manufacturing muscle than the US. And this technological ascendance, I think, is why the rules and standards governing these technologies are important and will be more important going forward. The risks and threats that American firms would face in such an environment would only multiply if Chinese technologies and technological standards become adopted across the world, like Eric mentioned, as Chinese applications and products are increasingly used across the world. So it's not just Chinese apps and platforms alone, but the underlying ideas and norms as well, since they espouse certain on issues like privacy, data security, cloud sourcing, which could leave behind increased cyber risks, the loss of privacy and personal information, and eventually could compromise national security, right? So, and I think on one level, if you look at the Trump administration's multifaceted strategy to constrain China's technological rise is weakened, though, by the need to strike a balance between being open and being closed, right? So what is the balance here? Can America's tech supremacy be protected and be sustained by disrupting and undermining the international economic order, or the levels of openness in trade, investment, research, and development that have led to so many incredible tech advancements all over the world? The key question is now, to me at least, is will these US policies, with the range of export controls, sanctions, the multilateral initiatives, will they fundamentally undermine the core aspects of America's tech supremacy and leadership, such as welcoming foreign students, being far more open to foreign workers, permitting foreign acquisitions, especially in the tech sector, and allowing the transfer of technologies like AI, robotics, and quantum computing? So can the US convince China to play by the existing rules of the road, or will it risk in some ways the international economic order that it helped create to carve out a competing sphere where liberal rules with respect to trade and technology exist, right? And it looks like, to me at least, that China is preparing for a world where it cannot rely on the US and US partners for essential technologies, with increased investments in areas like semiconductors, AI, and 5G, as you mentioned earlier. And a bifurcated technology order will only innovate slowly and will impose considerable costs, both on firms and countries like India that have tried to somewhat remain neutral until recently. So how that sort of pans out going ahead will be interesting to watch. So I'll stop there.
So that's going to be part of the second half of what I had in mind of what we talk about, is essentially what happens, what is the impact. And I can already see there are a couple of questions to that effect. So folks, do keep the questions coming in. I'll try and take them once we come to that particular part of the conversation. But I wanted to get some of our discussions in. Gaurav, I knew you wanted to talk about this aspect of it in terms of what's driving this competition, and also you had an interesting point about, well, is it necessarily going to be competitive throughout? So please, Gaurav, go ahead.
Thanks, Manoj. So given the current situation and the drivers of competition that both of you have just outlined, what might be the unlikely, if you will, potential détente between the US and China? What might that look like, right? If at all it can happen. And what can be done by each side, keeping in mind its core strategic objectives and the prevailing political realities, to arrive at a situation where both could possibly tolerate, if not like the situation.
All right, Eric, do you want to take that? I mean, could we end up seeing some sort of a grand bargain on technology between China and the US that could then end up creating issues for other countries?
Well, listen, the US has wanted a rational arrangement with China long before the Chinese Communist Party had it. I mean, recall that in 1945, when most of Asia had been devastated by a war, the US struggled to improve China's world standing on the assumption that China would play a major role in building a stable, peaceful, and anti-imperial order in Asia. All that changed in 1949 when China fell to a Chinese Communist Party. After the openness and the reform and opening that began under Deng Xiaoping in the 1970s and continued, I think, well into the 2000s, up until 2008, the constant focus of the United States was to deepen its cooperation with China. The fundamental assumption on the part of a lot of American policymakers was that more cooperation would lead to even more cooperation in all fields. And I would say that, objectively speaking, there is no other country in the world that has done more to abet the rise of China and to help China fulfill its 21st century dream of national rejuvenation than the United States. The problem, and I realize that this is a uniquely American distinction, but the problem is that the Chinese Communist Party threw this away for reasons that I described earlier. It threw this away in 2008 when it came to the understanding that deepening cooperation with the US, and I should say the other highly advanced economies and sophisticated high growth economies of maritime Asia, it came to believe that if it continued to do that, it would risk undermining the party's monopoly of power at home. And the party itself has undertaken to change the rules. The United States fundamentally believes that competition between nations is good, but for that competition to be healthy, to serve the advance of human progress and human prosperity, you need to have settled rules. There needs to be a political consensus for peaceful competition to lift all boats. And that was what we aimed for. And now I believe China's leadership has decided that they're going to need to make rules that serve the party first and foremost, and that this is what has led to this bifurcated geopolitical situation and bifurcated technological landscape that Kartik had described. I think that because Xi Jinping and the people in the party have decided that this is necessary for the party's survival in the 21st century, a new détente is unlikely anytime soon. I would like to see certain aspects of the competition come to be bounded by a rational framework. But I do believe that technology, particularly because it can be used to all kinds of political purposes that I think undermines the peace in the world, will continue to be a major sticking point in the US-PRC relationship, and will continue to be a major field of rivalry between the two countries.
All right, that's sort of, I think it's really interesting because that sort of certainty for countries which are, which are watching this from the outside, that sort of lack of certainty about the possibility of the two sides cutting a deal of some sort creates a lot of, that's what creates complications for, say, decision makers in India in terms of, what do you do when you pick a side? And then, you end up realizing that the two sides have actually reached an agreement. But that's interesting to know that at least it using that sort of a détente at present is just not likely. Saurabh, you had a point to make, right?
I wanted to actually, Eric had an interesting geotech perspective, right? How China is using technology to get into different countries with basically surveillance related or anti-privacy technologies that it has perfected in its own country, and using that to increase its sphere of influence. But one point I wanted to make there was that it's, although there is a technology angle to it, but this technology is not really unique, and it's very substitutable, right? And in fact, all the technologies that currently China, we have been discussing either in AI or surveillance, etc. I think there would be probably many people in the world who would be able to execute or do those things. But I think it comes with a combination of China's economic power, where they are able to provide them at a very cheap cost or at no cost. And I think there's also this angle that many people would not be willing to support despots and dictators in doing the things that they want to do. And there is sort of a perverse incentive where China would end up actually promoting most of the bad actors, because those are the actors who would want something like that and in fact make them beholden. And probably it serves other geopolitical purposes for China as well, that you have people who are kind of beholden to Chinese largesse in consolidating their own position in their countries, right?
Yeah.
So I would think it's a bigger geopolitical issue than technology is just a smaller. It's not arms, etc., which are very restricted or people can't make them. It's a pretty nuanced position Eric mentioned, and I wanted to basically highlight that point again, and underscore the fact that this is not a technology edge, more than a geopolitical strategy with economic power that China is playing.
Yeah, if I could say something to that real quick. You know, in the US, there's a saying you should never play billiards or pool with somebody who brings their own stick. My own view is that Huawei normally is able to bring its own table when it enters into a new country. And it does that largely because of state subsidy and the protections that it gets within the PRC. That may simply be the Chinese way of doing business, but it's clear that as a state-directed company, this also serves the ends of the Chinese Communist Party. It's true, Saurabh, that these technologies are able to be replaced, able to be substituted. The problem is that a lot of countries with large that ultimately end up taking on Huawei technology, it's very expensive for them to leave it, to shift to a new platform, particularly poorer countries. And so the option, once you're locked into the Chinese technosphere, the PRC technosphere, their options come to be limited and reduced. Now, the United States and Japan together, both individually and together, have been experimenting and developing all kinds of new technological platforms that could potentially be of great use to countries, including poorer countries that don't have the means to move themselves out of the PRC technosphere. Some of this has to deal with what you're familiar with, Saurabh, Open RAN 5G or virtualized 5G networks that are software-based rather than hardware-based. These permit countries and the private sectors of different countries to cooperate with a range of different partners around the world. At the same time, they open up the possibility of putting the control of data back into the hands of their sovereign governments. In other words, countries can invent AIs that will ensure that data that should not be transferred to PRC stays within a given country. I think that from this perspective, technological advance will likely upset the Huawei national sponsor model, national champion model in years to come. But 5G is just the opening battle in this larger struggle over defining technology norms.
Right. I want to sort of move on to the sort of second half of what I had in mind of what we could talk about. And I think we've already sort of touched upon this, which is about this sort of divide between China and the US, and this sort of leading to possibly a new iron or silicon curtain, whatever phrase you like, dividing the world into different spheres. You've got, from a Chinese point of view, they've talked about something like, cyber sovereignty. They've talked about data sovereignty. We've heard terms like splinter net, where everybody has their own internet. Karthik alluded to the fact that we can, and we've seen this in the US, right? Increasingly, Chinese researchers, academics have come under scrutiny, some justified, some unjustified. But even if that's the case, at the end of the day, that lack of talent flow, the restrictions on capital in terms of where it goes, how does that impact the sort of broader development of technology around the world? And Karthik sort of alluded to this in his remarks where he said that it sort of could slow down the development of technology around the world. And also in terms of what are the sort of norms that we can end up seeing shape, right? But the first question that I wanted to ask is that, and Eric, in your remarks, you've sort of made it fairly clear that as this competition is going to deepen, firstly, is the splitting of this technology ecosystem, if it's not desirable, is it feasible? Is it possible to do that and to continue to grow, leaving out from an American perspective such a major market and power like China? From an American strategic interest perspective, is it possible to do that? Is it even feasible, or is it desirable in the end?
Well, it wasn't until I would say 1991 that the American idea of innovation came to be conjoined with economic globalization. and the idea that globalization and economic and technological cooperation around the world would lead to a general harmonic convergence of the different nations in the world. I think that what we are seeing right today is a decoupling of innovation from globalization, and that is necessary. Is it desirable? It's not always desirable from the perspective of the financial industry or from the perspective of companies that rely on large markets in order to make themselves run. But I do think that there are geopolitical and national security interests that are driving this. Now, the bifurcation of the technological landscape, or rather its splinterization, because I think it's deeper than a bipolar division, frankly. The splinterization of the landscape is always going to have, there's always going to be technological workarounds, but it's very clear that states have political and economic interests in driving this splinterization. And so I think it's going to be a permanent feature in the world in the 21st century until states can come to some sort of political consensus amongst themselves that cooperation is better for them. I do think that the challenge for the United States, because we are, after all, 5% of the world's population, the challenge for the United States is fundamentally a diplomatic one. It's a question for our alliances and partners and how to establish arrangements and standards between like-minded countries around the world to create markets of scale that will enable innovation and globalization to carry forward, albeit in ways in which PRC's ability to integrate with that will be constrained. I think that that's where we're headed, to be honest with you, just by virtue of the nature of the strategic and political and economic rivalry that is taking place in the Pacific today between the US and PRC. We're going to see more of an effort to build, for example, a technological ecosystem which is led by the democracies and which can certainly cooperate with China, but will have very high standards and to prevent the leakage of sensitive and advanced technologies to China in ways that enable the party state that controls China to either subjugate and repress the Chinese people or to ratchet up the international crises that Beijing has been relentlessly manufacturing in both the South China Sea and in India's Himalayas.
All right, Karthik, I want to turn to you with that. Just taking off from what Eric's spoken about, the fact that you could end up seeing this set of democracies sort of cooperating, and that would set up this, I presume that if you have a set of countries that are cooperating and not under this sort of global umbrella of the WTO or the UN, you'd end up seeing different norms in different parts of the world. How would that impact, say, a state like India? At one level, I would presume that India would prefer being in a sort of democracy or US-led technology ecosystem where there is greater transparency, there is greater accountability, there is some sort of rule of law. Yet on the other hand, we also see India being part of, say, a BRICS discussion on digital sovereignty. India is part of the SCO. How do we make sense of this dichotomy in India? And also for countries outside of this US-China framework, like India and say others in Africa or in East Asia, are they viewing it from the perspective of this value prism? Or is it from the perspective of essentially development and who gives us the best opportunities?
Right. So, before I answer the India specific question, I want to just maybe broaden the frame and talk about global governance and how that's also been evolving given this clash between US and China and where the gaps are there and how the emergent global governance is forming now. So I think, most of the global governance arrangements of the 20th century, were not constructed to handle a major power clash like the one that we are witnessing now between US and China, right? I think the first reason is politics, right? The problems today are the legacies of deep interdependence, which has generated discord between major powers, especially US and China. And because the US is unwilling to continue underwriting China's rise, and China's rise has also caused considerable economic disruptions in the US that has led to the hollowing out, of certain parts of the US, right? So the status quo here will not continue, but global rules and institutions cannot manage this unwinding because they were not designed to do that, right? And second is that the key issues that require global governance today, which include the digital and the technology matters, have deep political resonance and value within countries that render them very difficult to be negotiated in large multilateral fora. So what you are then seeing in the absence of sort of global arrangements being formed to negotiate rules is we're seeing more plurilateral agreements and initiatives like the TPP, the CPTPP, RCEP, and recent tech initiatives like the D10, the Prague 5G conference, and so on and so forth, where countries that share certain political values, security interests, and also economic ties find it easier to devise rules and agreements on trade, which also cover issues like technology, intellectual property, labor, and so on. So my guess is that these kinds of arrangements and initiatives will continue to grow, will proliferate, as the US and its partners cleave away from China economically and politically. So what does that mean for India, right? So India will have to make choices going ahead, in terms of global governance, foreign policy, and how it wants to shape digital rules, right? I think given the importance of technology and the digital economy to India, India has no choice but to engage in shaping digital rules in areas like data, AI, 5G, cybersecurity, and so on. So India has to be a rule shaper because the costs of not doing so are high. Either you will have to exit or abstain from these kinds of plurilateral rules, which has happened in the case of RCEP, or that you adhere to rules that are set by other countries, right? And both outcomes are not optimal for India, given India's economic size and the importance, as I mentioned, of the growing digitization in India and the digital economy more broadly. But as global governance, moves into clubs, moves into selective clubs, I think, India will have to robustly shape rules on data, on cybersecurity, AI, because these will affect the broader patterns of trade and investment, but also eventually security. So being passive will definitely not cut it for India. So in terms of technology and digital issues, let me just add this before I end. There's also a growing trend to internationalize certain standards. So especially the US and the EU have begun sort of creating new standards that they are internationalizing and exporting through either bilateral or multilateral trading arrangements. Now, the flip side is for countries like India, is you either accept these rules or you at worst lose market access in the US and in other parts of the advanced world. And this, I think, binds India's hands and binds the hands of a lot of developing countries who will have to make choices, in terms of the standards and rules that will govern issues like AI, data, cybersecurity, and going ahead. And some of these, will also, I think, clash with domestic interests. So, for example, in India, especially on the data side, there's a big push towards data sovereignty and having data rules that promote the interest of the state and the state business nexus. But if you're looking at it more broadly from a trade point of view, you're going to have to somehow somehow comply and accept with the trade-offs here. And India has to figure out what they are going to be and how to manage that going forward.
All right, I'm just going to post one audience question to you, Karthik, before I go ahead to our discussions again. Navid asks, with China's growing investments in India's technology ecosystem, how should India balance these priorities, right? Because over the last, and we've heard these figures, right? Over the last 3 years or 4 years, China has invested 8 or 9 billion through different forms. Chinese companies actually have invested $8 or $9 billion in the Indian tech ecosystem. And we've seen India push back as part of what's happening right now on the border, push back against greater scrutiny for investments, banning apps, and so on and so forth. How does a country like India sort of balance its interests in terms of ensuring that there is capital available for this development, but also keeping security?
Well, it's going to be hard, right? And as we're realizing that having China embedded within your technology ecosystem and within your economy is not necessarily a constraint to Beijing and how it acts, right? So what kind of, so how are you going to adjust to a new environment where you would like more Chinese investments, particularly in some of the Indian unicorns and startups, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of competition for capital, and capital is scarce, and there are not that many alternatives for a lot of the Indian companies in terms of getting more investment in, right? But more, I think, I was dealing with this question a lot here because a lot of Singapore companies also have investments in India, and they're trying to figure out what kind of and how the Indian landscape is going to change and what their future is going to be. But in a sense, what I would think is this will have to be sorted out in the next 5-10 years, and see if some of the other some of the other tech investors, like SoftBank, for example, will step in and absorb some of these investments that China has made. That could happen, or if, and as we've been seeing in the last 2-3 months, because of ongoing security tensions with China, that a lot of Indian companies are becoming a lot more keen to partner with American firms, American tech firms, for investment. So, we're going to have to see how this pans out. But as we've seen, that these investments have not turned out to be much of a constraint to Beijing and the broader security relationship between India and China.
Yeah, indeed. If I could only add to that, Navid, I think, a lot of the questions that have come in are essentially about what should India be doing. So if I could just add to what Karthik said and what's already been said is that, part of the answer could lie in actually creating a robust set of domestic regulation, which actually limits the influence that foreign investors can have in decision-making and things like that, that could possibly be helpful. Because at the end of the day, you also do need capital, and you also need better regulation, which can actually do that. And along with that, you could then set up systems which support, at least address those security concerns that you might have, rather than actually, blocking out money that might be coming in. But then that's just me. I want to turn to Shruti, one of our discussants, and ask her to share her thoughts and pose a question. Shruti?
Hi. So Karthik said in the first half that China has been kind of dismissed as a copycat nation for a pretty long time. And it was only over the last couple of years, really, that it has come to be seen as a legitimate threat. And the historical American context with these threats, though, has been to respond with innovation. So, for example, like with the atom bomb or with space travel. So, do you think that that now assessing China as a threat can actually be a shot in the arm for American innovation? Because there has been a sense of fatigue around the American story, and so maybe would this sort of spur a new era of American innovation? Or would it be more like what you spoke about, Karthik, in the second half, where this is going to be about global coalitions and countries working together?
Eric, I think I want to come with that to you first. We have a new Sputnik, but that again came from Russia this time in terms of vaccine. I mean, are we seeing something like that again happening in the US where there is renewed focus? And if that's the case, how is that playing out?
There's certainly renewed focus on innovation, and that is fundamentally, I think, a policy issue because our culture is fundamentally still innovative. That hasn't exhausted itself. But as I can say here in Washington, that as our country thinks about the long-range recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, among other things, and how best to onshore certain industries that we have spent the last 30 years offshoring. And also as we begin to decouple innovation from globalization, there is very serious thinking here in Washington about where and how to create the proper policy arrangements to spur on the innovation that the country has always done and will continue to do. Meanwhile, China is no longer a copycat country. I always thought that it was quite high-handed of people to dismiss China as merely a copycat country, even a decade ago. It's shown that it too can innovate. And I suspect that both countries, where we are, as PRC analysts say, in a contest of systems, and we're going to see if China's corporate Leninism can stack up against the American Republic and its allies with the other democracies. That's how I see it. I do know that there is definitely a race on in terms of AI, in terms of quantum computing, in terms of next-gen telecommunications. All of this race has been joined in the United States by business and by government, and it will continue.
All right, Saurabh?
Can I just, sorry,
Karthik, please go ahead.
I just want to add one point there is, there was a previous question earlier about a possible détente between US and China anytime soon. I think one argument for why there will be no reset or détente in 2021 or thereafter is, I think that the broader politics, right, of tensions remaining high between both countries in terms of technology and trade helps them advance certain domestic priorities, particularly in broad agendas that focus on innovation. So if you look at the US, both houses of Congress recently have introduced new efforts to boost semiconductors. They've created a new national research cloud, and they're trying to revamp immigration policies to bring in more skilled labor for AI and quantum computing. And similarly in China, there are a number of different efforts, like Manoj alluded to earlier. Right? Beijing has unveiled new plans to build a new tech infrastructure through AI, data, and 5G and other technologies, to support Chinese tech and integrating concerns of patriotism and so on in trying to boost the domestic tech space to continue innovating, right? So I think these two national innovation plans are somehow also emboldened by tensions and a climate of hostility, which normally would not exist if that was not the case, right?
Yeah, all right. It's indeed interesting to see how both sides are actually, and it's also, you can actually see the different approaches to development and innovation play out actually in front of your eyes, which is really fascinating. Saurabh, you had a point to make, right?
Yeah. I thought, so we've obviously been talking about things which could happen in the future, like possibly a quantum computing breakthrough could make a big difference, could be like a Sputnik movement or something. But I think even now, we probably didn't touch upon this physical supply chains. I think the physical supply chain of many of the technologies, especially say given the EV revolution that we are trying to create in India, and our dependence on neodymium magnets, for example, from China. So there are physical and I mean TSMC is in Taiwan, and for some reason there definitely is a non-zero probability of a scenario that it falls into Chinese hands. And if that kind of a thing happens, what happens to the world's silicon supply? right? I think the scenario planning around physical supply chain and physical dependence on China for critical technical components is probably more critical as of now. I think some of the things that we discussed are definitely forward and future looking, but I would say clear and present danger is probably on those moving of atoms rather than the bits.
Yeah, so in that case, we could possibly see a silicon curtain, right?
Yeah,
Dividing the world.
I think, yeah, I not just silicon, rare earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, all rare earth elements actually. Yeah.
So indeed, Eric, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, right? Just the nature of the physical supply chain and sort of the immediate challenges of addressing that. I mean, we've seen on rare earths, we've seen ever since the first sort of Chinese ban to sale in Japan in 2012, if I'm correct, there was a push to sort of generate alternatives. How would we see something like this play out in this current environment?
That's a good question. We've definitely seen the politicization, and some people would call it the weaponization of supply chains. That has not been a unilateral American move. In fact, it began in Australia and in Japan. The United States is still formulating, I think, what it wants to achieve. But what is clear is that the major critical supply chains around the world are coming to be scrambled and reshaped. And this is largely being driven by geopolitical competition. 3 days ago, new regulations at the US Department of Commerce made it so that companies cannot sell semiconductors, advanced computer chips, to PRC companies like Huawei without a US government approval. And as you're well aware, because the technologies that go into the creation of the most advanced semiconductors are all American, the US has an enormous amount of power to fundamentally shut down Huawei's supply chain. I don't know if we've made the political decision to do that or not, but the power is there, and that power derives from the last 40 years of American innovation in semiconductor technology. The concern that policymakers and business are grappling with now is how, this is a way of denying access to certain things that Huawei might need. But there are potential political perils in doing this, and that fundamental focus of, as I suggested earlier, U.S. policy and U.S. business going forward is how to innovate the next generation of semiconductors, among other things, and that needs to be the focus going forward. But it's very clear that 2 years ago we began this conversation about how to secure critical supply chains in Tokyo, and there were no takers for this discussion just 2-3 years ago. And now it is certainly the way most of Asia's advanced democracies are thinking about their economic futures, and they see redesigning supply chains as critical to their security and their economic security.
Indeed. I agree. Yeah, that's been a debate even in India over the last few months. Actually, more than the last few months, but it's become more sharp in the last few months about dependencies and how do you diversify your supply chains. Across in Europe, there's a conversation about resilience and so on and so forth, and I agree with that. Gaurav, do you want to pose your question or your comment?
Sure. So Taiwan has been a key beneficiary of the US-China trade ties in the technology domain over the past 2 decades. And Taiwanese technology companies have invested large amounts in manufacturing bases in China and setting up supply chains. And this has helped them effectively service both the US and the Chinese markets. And again, Taiwanese professionals and managers have played a very key role in the growth of the Chinese tech sector, technology companies, and institutions also, with large numbers of Taiwanese expats still in China. Right? So how do you see the Taiwanese technology sector being impacted by the growing US-China rivalry, and what are the broader economic, political, and strategic implications for Taiwan from this rivalry?
Karthik, do you want to take that, talking about Taiwan, and also a little bit about, could India be doing much more with Taiwan than it is on technology?
Yeah, so I think Taiwan could be a beneficiary of the growing need to diversify tech investments and restructure supply chains from China, right? This is not just Taiwan, but even other countries in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, who could benefit because of a skilled services sector, and also because there were already pre-existing American firms who were operating here, right? I think reshoring has already been happening from China back to Taiwan as Taiwanese firms relocate some production back home and also redirect capital to certain manufacturing industries in their own side, on their side of the strait. And I think the Taiwanese government has also helped here with tax breaks and other kinds of support, and that investment has cushioned some of the blow from the ongoing tech war between U.S. and China and the pandemic. Just a few days ago, Google announced plans to establish their third data center in Taiwan, and that's something that's really interesting. It's part of this Smart Taiwan initiative, which is also, I think, got a lot more emphasis now. And I think going forward, you'll probably see some more work on the AI and computer science talent training front in Taiwan, and that will also deepen. And the other thing I would also, with respect to supply chains, is the interesting role that Japan is also playing across the region. They've come out with a fund, if I recall, it's about $2 billion to help Japanese companies reshore their parts of production from China to other parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia. So there's a broader push toward of diversification that's already been happening and could probably extend going ahead as new rules come into play as well. In terms of India and Taiwan, I don't know enough about ties there. I know that there's a growing relationship, especially on the foreign policy side, and there's a lot of emphasis on security ties. But I'm not, and I think, but Taiwan is definitely a source that India can tap onto to deepen, its production footprint in East Asia and Southeast Asia, definitely.
All right, Shruti, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left, and I want to get one intervention from Shruti, and then just one audience question to finish the conversation off. So Shruti, let's have your comment.
Cool. So India has had an instinct towards non-alliance historically. So what would that look like in this new context? Should we be working with countries like Japan and Europe to create alternatives to American and Chinese technologies, or kind of just embrace this American alliance?
I think, Karthik, why don't you take that, and very briefly, and Eric, if you could add to that about, how would the US view India remaining non-aligned? Karthik, you first.
Well, I think non-alliance doesn't neatly map onto a lot of different issue areas, right? Especially when you talk about trade, technology, even issues like climate change, global health. We're dealing with a pandemic now. So how does non-alignment or even strategic autonomy, for that, if you take that as a discourse or a slogan that governs Indian foreign policy, I don't think it maps neatly onto some of the pressures that the international system poses on India now, which I think will be governed a lot more pragmatically, a lot more rationally, and with a focus on interests in mind, and not necessarily ideas or a sense of compromising one's space or one's autonomy if you're cooperating with a certain power or not. So I think, my sense is that interests, especially as we deal with very practical, concrete issues that affect economic growth in India that affect the bottom line, the government will be able to take a lot more rational decisions in terms of these issues that tie technology and trade. And the other reason I think why that'll happen is because the existing multilateral system has changed, right? And we are negotiating and dealing with countries on these issues in clubs that discuss standards on these matters. So when you're talking about a standard on AI or innovation or cybersecurity, it's a lot more technical, right? And it's not very political. And where core ideas related to, say, equity or a sense of fairness, which have dominated Indian foreign policy for decades, might not matter as much. So I think, and this is the sense that I also got from the External Affairs Minister's book, which was released recently. And he came on and he talked about India's foreign policy and its strategy on a number of emergent issues like the ones we have discussed today. India has no choice but to be more pragmatic and rational, and I think it will be so.
Eric, how would the US deal with a sort of hard-nosed bargain with India on issues like, say, data, localization? The Indian government has talked about data sovereignty, data being national wealth, and so on and so forth, whatever that essentially means. But how would the US deal with a far more quarrelsome India on issues of technology? Or would there be more room for bargain today?
Oh, well, there's certainly more room for bargaining today. I do think, to be honest with you, a lot of American and also Indian pieties of the 20th century don't apply to the 21st for all of the reasons that Karthik had just explained. In technology, listen, India has the technological prowess and wherewithal and the size to become an AI technological superpower in the 21st century. It is the geotechnological swing state par excellence, I think, from my perspective. India has a lot of big choices ahead, policy choices, political choices. There's clearly a very strong inclination in India to pursue a national, what we could call very generally a national path of digital development. I can understand the merits of that from the perspective of some of the population in India. My concern, however, is that by using a highly restrictive national approach to data regulation, data governance, it will severely limit and constrain India's economic and trading potential with other democracies, including the United States, Japan, and Europe. And so I would worry that a movement in the direction of creating a Indosphere, a technological Indosphere, would actually seriously limit India's economic growth and potential in the 21st century. And this is one of those areas, particularly in technology, where less protectionism, I think, as an outsider, makes a lot more sense from India's perspective. As a contributor to a democratic ecosystem, India would have as much say as any other large country in the shaping of the rules and standards of that system, and therefore can design laws that enable trade while at the same time ensuring that India has sovereign say over how its data is used. I actually think that this is extremely important, probably as important as the advanced cooperation that we've been seeing in the military and in the intelligence realms today.
All right, Eric, you leave me with much more optimism than I got on to this conversation with. I want to ask one last question, taking it from the audience questions. A lot of the conversation that we've had so far has been very state-centric in many ways. And Rahul Sharma asks, what's the role for the private sector in this, in terms of pushing back against this sort of nationalization of technology in some way, or increasing state interference in the tech domain, and sort of imposing export control regimes and so on and so forth. It's interesting because we've not spoken about big tech at all. the mega companies that are dominating some of this. What happens to the private sector? We have about a minute left. So very briefly, what happens to the private sector as you see more state intervention, Eric?
This is a new discussion in Washington, but there are people on the American center left and on the center right that have increasingly seen big tech as problematic, both from a perspective of US economic competitiveness and also national security. And there's a lot of proposals being debated now across the American political spectrum about whether big tech serves our larger interests of innovation and security. So this issue is very brand new and it's extremely complex. So perhaps we can get together again sometime soon to talk a little bit about this in greater depth.
All right, Karthik, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Just on the big tech part, I think the interesting thing in India is that there's a big tech in India that's Indian as well, that have a considerable amount of clout and power over policies in this area, which might differ a lot from the American big tech. So what we might be seeing is different kinds of big tech competing for policies in a country like India that has the size and potential to shape rules on data and other issues. So that's a great question. And I would just add that we probably need to differentiate between different big techs as we try to analyze their influence on these policies as well.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you so much, Karthik, Shruti, Gaurav, Saurabh, and everyone for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation. And I hope you continue to engage with us as part of this China Challenge series. The next conversation is on next Friday, where we will be talking about Belt and Road, again, something that's tremendously contentious. Thank you so much, and hope you all have a good evening and a good day wherever you are.